Hey everyone, Christopher Ruocchio here of Sun Eater, back for another roundtable discussion. This time with my friends Jordan from iWizard and Nicholas Kotar. Nicholas, you're new on the channel. Jordan's been here a couple times. Would you like to tell everybody a bit about yourself?
I write epic fantasy inspired by Russian fairy tales. I also do it by publishing myself, and now recently I've gotten into the publishing game, and I'm going to start publishing other people too, in a kind of hybrid publishing house that's very brazenly taking the moniker of "We are publishing this generation's Inklings." So,
Oh, that's awesome. So I didn't actually know that when I asked you to come on here. So this is even better because we've got the small press stuff represented too.
yeah,
Awesome. Well, congratulations on getting that rolling. That's great.
yeah, it's going to be fun. We haven't started yet, but we're getting there.
What are you gonna call it?
We're calling it Wood Between Worlds Press.
Awesome. So everybody be on the lookout for that. So I thought what we would do, broadly speaking, is have a conversation about publishing. Obviously, I mostly traditionally published. I've done some self-publishing stuff between Kickstarter and like Amazon Kindle Direct stuff, but Nicholas, you mostly or exclusively, right, independently published. So I thought we'd represent the two camps, and Jordan here is working on his own book. He and his wife have written one, and they're trying to publish it.
Cool.
Zin is saying there's no audio. The people having trouble hearing me, or is it just Zin? Let me know in the chat, guys. Sorry about that. We'll figure out what's going on. If it's maybe it's my turn to have boomered it, Jordan. Anyway, so what I thought we'd do is sort of is talk about publishing, because I'm sure that a number of people who watch the video may looks like we got audio, maybe wanting to write a book of your own, and they're sort of wondering what the field looks like. And I thought I would just sort of give like a broad overview of traditional publishing real quick, and then and throw it to you, Nicholas, for the indie stuff. And then Jordan, you had some questions, so I thought we'd go into that after that. So traditional publishing is like what your mom thinks of, right, when she thinks of publishing books. That's is a publisher probably in New York City who you have to get an agent to talk to, and they send you money, and they edit your book, and they pick the cover, and they theoretically at least get the books into bookstores. That is, of course, only one form of publishing. That is what I do. Doll Books is in New York City, and they published my first 5 novels. Bane used to be in New York City. They moved. Some publishers are starting to move now. They're realizing you don't have to pay New York rents, but they do the same thing. It's mostly through agents. You can submit to publishers like this sometimes directly. They'll have slush piles. You've probably heard of those. They've got a literal pile in the office. At least they used to. Now it's an email folder somewhere where people send their books in, and they'll eventually read them and maybe offer you money. But usually what you do is you get an agent, and they go and talk to editors and try to sell your book to them, sort of as an inside man. And then they will pay you money. You'll get an advance, and they'll work on editing your book and getting it out into stores. Usually there are exceptions. The traditional published books are the books you see in Barnes and Noble. I know stores are a little bit better about doing some independent stuff now. There are avenues to get your books into stores if you're not publishing traditionally, but that is something I don't have a lot of experience with. So I was hoping maybe we could get into that. Nicholas, how did you come to independent publishing? Like, what was the thought process there, and how did you go about doing it?
Well, strap in, guys, because Christopher, you very kindly suggested that we should not make this combative, and I won't. But my story is unfortunately one of the not so happy ones when it comes to traditional publishing. And those of you listening, you have to understand that Christopher is not a typical story when it comes to traditional publishing, especially these days. It helps that his idea and his story is so good, of course. So that's the other thing. If you have a story as good as Christopher's, then you'll probably be fine. Clearly mine wasn't, but I will give you the full story. So I went the traditional route like everybody else did. Initially I did the slush pile thing, and this would have been around 2012, 2013 or so. And even at that point, it was ridiculous. Nobody actually looks at the slush piles. And now with AI, forget it. It's just not even happening. The only way you're really going to get the attention of an agent is if you make a personal contact. Even back then, now much more so. So the way that I did it was to do some of these writer boot camps that Writers Digest used to do. I'm not sure they do them anymore, but basically they have these boot camps that are run by editors and agents, and it gives you an opportunity to submit some of your work to people who usually buy, and with the idea that they'll give you suggestions on how to improve it. And then if it's good enough, you might actually get an offer. And I was lucky. Well, you have to pay for these, right? So it's not so much luck, but I got kind of it was good because I got really good feedback on my work, but it wasn't complete. So I couldn't submit to agents at that point. So I ended up finishing the book. It took me about a year and a half after that, and I started to submit after that. And through some connections, I got the call from a guy in one of the top 3, I think, New York. I'm not going to say who it is because, as you're going to find out in a second, why I won't say the name.
Sure.
But this was a major agency, and it was a young agent, but he was very eager to build his catalog. So he went kind of out of his way to make me feel welcome, and it was a great moment. I'll admit it. I mean, I never expected anything like that, to be honest, and just getting it out of the blue. And he said all the nicest things he could about my books. I was like, okay, this is going to be great. Over the next year, I never heard from him again. And I would occasionally call him, and every time I called him, he would get less and less. He would remember me less and less, until by the very end, he had no idea who I was when I was calling him. And very soon after that, said agent was fired for ethics violations. And 2 years later, I look on the website, and he's back in the VP position. Nepotism, baby. So,
Okay.
So that was my experience. Basically, as he explained to me, he actually didn't send any personalized requests to publishers. He stuck my pitch in with a bunch of others, hit a mass send, and just waited, and nothing happened, because that's not how you make connections in the publishing.
Yeah, that is not how it works at all.
No.
Yeah, mine. I maybe it's a generational thing, because my agent, forgive me, Shauna, is older. She's not one of the young Turks, I suppose. But it was pretty different. She I think she just sent it directly to people that she knew.
Yeah.
Which is like how you're supposed to do it. Yeah. But there really seems to be a generational divide. This is true of editors too. Things are changing in ways that I don't understand, and I sometimes feel like I got on the train like right as it was leaving the station, and like they were demolishing the station behind me. It sort of, it feels like that sometimes, because I got in like in the like most sort of like stereotypical like Stephen King typewriter way. Right. I sent query letters out cold. With like literally nothing in my bio at all. I had a college professor who once taught at one of the Clarion workshops for science fiction. Yeah. And so I mentioned that I like studied under a former Clarion professor, but like I stuck the word Clarion into my query letter.
Hey, that shines like a beacon.
that was what did it, right? But I was like totally faking it, right? Because I didn't go. I didn't pay up to go to Clarion at all. Although that is a thing you could do. There are like writers camps and workshops like this that are known to agents, and that do have a shine to them that helps your name poke out in submissions, but that's like not necessary, or at least is theoretically not necessary. These days the way to do it seems to be is to go to literary conventions and like physically speak to agents and then email them later, and that
personal touch that helps.
Yeah, and that has a COVID. Yeah, because there's so much of the process too is like to coin a phrase is shit testing, right? There's a certain element of like trying to make sure that people aren't crazy, because we would get like the strangest submissions, because I was on the other side of this too. Right. I would be in the office and like see the slush pile, and people would bribe us, or writers would do weird things like send their submissions in crayon or something because they thought it would make them stick out, or I heard stories how like back in the day they used to receive let's say candid photographs from.
Are you serious?
From certain people, but this is decades ago. I did not see any of these. But it's a mess, right? I know that Bain would go through 100, 120 submissions a month, and and of those, like maybe one or two would get waived on, and it's difficult to go in that way. So the agents theoretically are a screening process, but of course many of them are, as you found out, are not the best. But yeah. So then you like went independent after that. You said,
well, it was more than that. So during the process, I ended up taking a sabbatical from my work and going to Eastern Europe for a year, and it gave me a lot of space and time to kind of just study, read, write, and learn a little bit about the industry, because I wasn't happy about the way that this was all going, and it didn't sound like all the things that I was reading in all of the writers' guides about how this was actually supposed to go. And so I ended up reading a lot of stuff written by Christine Catherine Rusch, who is a huge advocate for independent publishing in general, which is interesting because she and her husband were huge in the traditional space, but they were also, and she especially being a woman, kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place at a point during publishing's history, that there was a little bit of unpleasant sort of toxicity going on, especially in SIFWA. So she ended up being on the wrong end of the stick, so to speak, and ended up feeling the full force of publishing's dark side, even though she was a very lucrative writer and somebody who was doing very well. There was really no reason for her not to continue to be somebody like Stephen King or George Martin. She did her big epic fantasy series at the same time as Game of Thrones, and it's just as good and the same kind of idea. It's called the Fae series, but didn't have the right backing, so that was that. But she writes a lot about why indie makes sense now, and she specifically hones in on the ownership issue and the ownership of copyright, and the issue of who do you want to be as a writer. If you're somebody who is interested in making this a career where you have control as much as you like over the different aspects of what you can do, then you must not go, this is her talking, you must not go into trade, because increasingly the contracts are starting to ask for life of copyright in all formats for the life of copyright, which is basically sign away your entire life all the way into 70 years after your death, and you're not going to get anything from it unless they willingly give it back to you. And buyback clauses are generally not put in contracts anymore, so things are getting more and more restrictive. So I actually didn't know that, and I was really kind of flabbergasted by the whole idea, and I realized to my own surprise that this was actually really important to me. Like the idea of publishing not just the book that I want, which is kind of every author wants to do that, and there's a lot of pride in that in the wrong sense. Like you should be willing to submit your work to editors who know how to craft it properly. So that's not what I mean. What I mean is that the idea of being able to take my stories and use them in different formats, set them up in special editions, do audio dramas, have a controlling stake in what happens to the IP, like whether I want to sell it to a certain streaming service or not, which by the way is all possible for indie publishers. I had an option in Hollywood for 3 years before it eventually expired. So and even with sales that are not up there in the New York Times level at all. So finding out about that, it made me realize that I actually don't want to have anything to do with the trade world, not because it's bad or because I'm expecting to be exploited, but because the idea of having this IP and being able to develop it the way that I want over the life of the copyright of every single book, and to do that in a way that grows my business slowly but surely over the long term, was something very attractive to me. So I came into it kind of as an authorpreneur kind of mindset, and which I didn't realize I had. But in the process of finding out about it, I realized if I'm going to go trade right now, I'm going to have to give up a lot of control, most likely. And I'm not sure that I'm happy with that idea. So I kind of closed the door to that, and I started to educate myself about the whole process of what it means to become an independent publisher / writer at the same time. You guys are probably hearing the screaming happening in the background there. Let me close the door. I have 4 kids, and they're not having a good day. Let me just put it that way.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah,
I'll wait then for him to come back, because I have a question for Nicholas on that. because I was going to ask him if he was someone who had tried publishing first, and then, that didn't work out for him. And then he went he went away from traditional publishing and decided to indie publish, or whether he knew all along he wanted to indie publish. But it sounds like, he had a bad experience. I don't know if that's an atypical experience, but I do have a question for him about that, because I imagine when he went and decided to indie publish, this was several years ago, probably. I went and looked at his Amazon page, and it looks like, oh, you're back, Nicholas. I can ask this to you directly.
Oh.
Let me ask, when did you start indie publishing?
So the first book that I okay, well, that's slightly longer story. In 2014, I finished my first book, and I put it up on Amazon with a makeshift cover done by a friend. And at that point in my life, I was not somebody who was particularly business minded. I was just I didn't know what I was doing. The book was not good. It was unedited. The cover was awful, and I kind of put it up as a favor to a friend who designed it for me. And this friend was a good friend, but she put in a lot of work for free on designing the whole thing, including the interior of it. And I felt really bad not putting it up on Amazon, so I did. It did nothing. I didn't know what I was doing, and it kind of just fizzed out. And I unpublished it. And it was at that point that I started to go and look for agents. So in the process, I kept working on my craft. And in 2018, I published my first book. And 2019, 2020, I think books 2 and 3, and then kind of finished the series by 2022.
Okay, so that's not that long ago, but even 2018, that's 6 years ago, and I imagine that indie publishing 6 years ago would have seemed more like a risk than it seems to a lot of people today. I mean, things are moving really quickly and changing really fast.
Yes.
Were you nervous about going into indie publishing 6 years ago, when most people that you would have asked back then would have said, "No, this is a last option. This isn't something that you want to start with. You want to send it out to all of the different agents and see if you can find one first."
Well, Jordan, the way that you're expressing it is very much the perspective of somebody who has grown up with the myth of the golden age of publishing, of publishing houses coming and enshrining you and putting you on a golden throne and kind of doing all the work for you. And all you have to do is go into your writer's shed and write in longhand like Neil Gaiman, and then just hand over the manuscript to someone. And then that someone puts magic fairy dust on it, and they put it in the bookstores, and the money just comes flying in, right? But actually by 2018, it was a pretty robust industry already. It's just that trad wasn't accepting it, because a lot of the sales figures were purposely being ignored. A lot of it was on Amazon's Kindle Unlimited, which is not determined by the numbers of books sold, but by the numbers of pages read. And but the amount of money that some people were making on it was ridiculous. It was astronomical. And I was too stupid to realize how risky it was. It was risky, and I didn't realize what it was that I didn't know. So on some level, it didn't hurt me because I didn't realize that what I was doing was dangerous. But I did recognize the one thing that the Christine Catherine Rush and Dean Smith said, and a lot of other people said, is that if you're going to go indie, it's a long game. But it's a game that if you do it right, there's a much higher chance that you're going to be able to sustain it for the long term. And the examples they gave were compelling, because they kept talking about authors who were big in the 90s, which was when they were at their heyday in the publishing business, and how many of them are not writing anymore because they're not able to get published, or because they burned out on the publishing schedules, or because all of the people that were their advocates are no longer there. They got fired, or because the money's not there anymore. And I'm sure we'll talk about this later, but now traditional publishing is going through actually all of publishing is going through a major shakeup that was just illumined by the recent antitrust lawsuit that was brought by the Department of Justice, where the the CEO of one of the big five, basically, I think it was Random House, admitted that the reason they're called Random House is because publishing is random, and they actually don't know what a good book means. In effect, like they don't know what's going to sell, which is, and he said this on the stand, and these are multi-billion-dollar corporations basically admitting that they have no business plan. So, but yeah,
can I ask you a question before we change topic there? Because I hope that's the case, because I'm having a frustrating experience trying to deal with traditional publishing right now.
Yeah.
Maybe we can talk about that later. But if that's the case, if what you say is true, Nicholas, and I hope it is, then why do so many people publish indie and then when they start selling well, move over to traditional? So examples that come to mind are, James Islington, who as soon as he could went traditional. Michael Sullivan,
Evan Winter.
Andy Weir. I could just list them for like the next hour of people who just published indie and then became so successful. I mean, the first half of that proves your point, but then they decide to go traditional.
Well, okay, so there's several things in there. One, I'll mention Michael Sullivan, because Michael Sullivan is not a traditionally published author. He's a hybrid
he started with a very small publishing house. Yes. They went out of business. Then he published indie, and then he got successful, and then he went traditional, like big house.
He's not fully traditional. Okay, so Michael Sullivan is a very successful author who uses both traditional and indie,
right.
And he keeps the rights to I believe his ebooks, although it might be to special editions, and he does regular Kickstarters that make him very good money. But to answer the larger question, it could be different reasons for each of those authors. I think the main reason is prestige. And let's just be honest. There is a definite and absolutely justified aura that's connected with getting crowned by a group of gatekeepers who are still considered to be tastemakers.
You hear that, Christopher? You have an aura.
He does.
Yes. Yeah, that's why I'm blue. I could not figure out my lighting today. So it was traditional publishing blessing me.
There you go. There you go. With blue light.
Yeah.
I think the other reason is that if you can show a very strong, basically, if you're bringing a strong audience, the theory behind it is that you're going to get a lot more promotional attention from the publishers. So they're going to give more marketing money. They're going to give more push. And that's, if you want to see your book in the local Barnes and Noble at the front table, being featured, at Powell's Books, at one of those specially chosen little things, then you still have to go the traditional route. Or if you want to get considered for an award, and that's the other reason why you would do it, is if you're interested in getting considered for a Hugo or a Nebula, you can't be indie, at least not right now.
There is another reason, of course, right, why someone might consider traditional publishing, and that is, and this is like a very silly way to put it, but that's ease, right? If you don't have if you don't have a clue what you're doing, right, and for whatever reason you're disinclined to like find out, then going to a company that can figure out typesetting and get you editorial services and a cover you can't afford on your own, then they can do that for you, and they will, and the good, or at least they should. Sometimes you get those bad covers, and other things happen. But
was it Tad Williams that went on social media to complain about one of his latest covers?
I couldn't possibly comment on that. No. So there are things that happen like that. But the reason that you do it is theoretically they'll at least handle that for you. Now, and marketing is like a whole other thing, because with traditional publishing, the reason they'll bring in these indie writers is because they know how to market themselves, and in part, right? And they are assuming they're bringing a big audience in. My experience in watching a lot of this happen, because I worked at Bain, we brought some indie authors in and tried to turn them into trad authors, is that they mostly flopped in that format, and they mostly flopped to that format because they were not the traditional publishers were not doing with the book listings whatever the indie writers were doing with those book listings.
Oh, isn't that interesting? Wow. Okay.
To make things work was like part of the problem. So they didn't understand the algorithm. Traditional publishers still don't understand Amazon's algorithm to the extent that indie writers do. But there are other issues too. Like it's a different business model. If you're producing one large novel once a year, it's different than say putting out a lot of the one of the various ways you sort of make a run at it with Amazon is producing smaller stuff more frequently, and that's like a different product, right? In the same way that like a tadpole is not a baby elephant.
That's right.
It's there's a bit of a mismatch. The trad pubs will always try to bring these writers in and say, hey, this is like a slam dunk, and when it's Andy Weir, it is, right, because he's already like so big that even if there's only like a 15% carryover from what his indie sales were, right, then he's fine. But of course, in Andy Weir's case, it actually worked. It worked, right? Like his audience got bigger, right? But most cases that's not true, and so you'll see they'll bring in these writers because they think, hey, that's going to be a real, conservative strategy. Here, we'll bring someone in with a big audience, and it'll be fine. And sometimes it works okay, sometimes it doesn't work. Nearly well enough, but they're sort of banking on the character of the writer being a little bit different, and the fact that they're bringing a platform to them already. Whether that's, this is the same reason they sign YouTubers, right?
It's true.
It's not because they believe that this YouTuber, right, who made a career making, I don't know, video game reviews, like really knows how to write a science fiction novel,
right?
It's like where they're just hoping the YouTube channel will push copies. Because of course publishing is random, right? So but when he said that, though, it's like it really is true. Like they have no clue, right? You can see this like very clearly if you look over at like YA, right? Something will happen, let's say Harry Potter, and they will run around trying to figure out how to replicate that because there's only one Harry Potter. And they'll fail, and then something will happen. It's Aragon. Aragon is the thing now.
Yeah. And
then people will imitate Aragon until Twilight comes along, and they will imitate that to death. And I think we just got through the YA dystopian post Hunger Games phase. I don't know where they're at now. But they'll do that, and they'll run these ideas in these cycles because they're counting on similarity to carry the day because they don't know what made any of those major successes in the first place. We see the same thing with Hollywood, right? With Mr. Reborn here saying sequel. They just bring in new people to write the sequels, right? But part of it too is that there's publishers have like an attention bandwidth issue because they're much smaller companies than people think they are. Bain is about a dozen people, DAW is about a dozen people, and so they can't. Theoretically, they're supposed to be doing all the marketing for you and sprinkling magic fairy dust on books and everything. Yeah. But they don't have the manpower or the attention to do that for every one of their books. Even if they're publishing on the small side, like 4 or 5 new titles a month, it's hard to allocate the kind of funding that science fiction publishers at least have. They're not the full $1 billion company, right?
There's also something else, Christopher, and this is something that I think you know very well, but it's that there's an issue, and that traditional publishers still haven't caught on to the fact that the internet has changed the way that the game works, and they're still directing all of their attention, especially the marketing attention, not at the readers for the most part. And I think Bain is one of the few that's actually changing this. They're actually doing a lot more direct-to-reader type marketing stuff. But most traditional publishers, especially the big 5, their primary customer is not the reader; it's the book distributor. It's the bookstore. So, in a world where Barnes and Noble had to be basically fished out of dead waters by the government, and the only way that they're surviving now is because of a crazy guy who came over from England and is basically just he's trying whatever, and it's working in some places, it's not working in others, but it's not what it used to be. There's no borders anymore. Nobody really goes to the bookstore to buy books. They go there to read them, and then they'll go and buy them in Amazon. While the way that people use the internet is more and more to find their little own bizarre micro niche that they're really excited about, like their tiny little super fandom that's small. And this is the one thing that some indie writers have figured out, is that you really don't need the same kind of firepower that the trad publishers give you if your interest is financial stability, not recognition in the wider culture, right? If what you're interested in is making a living, then what you need is not a massive audience, because the massive audience is not something that you can leverage again and again and again. What you need is a small audience of very enthusiastic super fans. And you don't even have to have that many. I mean, the famous number is Kevin Kelly's 1,000 true fans, but you can even do without that. You can do even smaller than that. And that's, the internet's really good at that. It's good at attracting people towards very specific and very odd signals. So if you're the kind of person that has the sort of ability to leverage your presence in the internet in a way that's going to attract a bunch of weirdos, the same weirdos that you are, then you can become quite successful quite quickly. And I say that because I'm one of them, so it's fine.
You've revealed my secret. Yeah. It's not lost on me that it's the same name as in the chat here every single time I come on and do one of these things.
Well,
so that right, exactly. Like I did the Kickstarter for the Diamond Edition last year, which they are printed, by the way, everybody. They're done. They have to dye the edges. I'll have them to you soon. Steve just told me yesterday. But I didn't think 1,000 people were going to show up like in 5 minutes and buy them all. That was pretty astonishing. But that was like that was enough that it had a marked, let's say, impact on my income for last year. Right, it was transformative in a lot of ways, and so to be able to do that sort of thing, separate from just like publishing the books in a normal, normally, right?
That's
in my case, traditionally.
Saying this is the future. The future of lucrative publishing for most writers is going to be special editions.
Yeah, it is sort of going deep, right, and playing to your groundlings as opposed to just leaving the doors open for anybody who can walk in. So that was sort of a big realization for me, because I was looking at obviously everybody was looking at Sanderson's Kickstarter, the big one when he did that. Was that 2 years ago now? And of course everybody, believe me, I know it ate all my paper. We're using the same printer, and that's what took so long.
Wow.
The special edition is we use the same paper too. And so Brandon ate all of my paper. Yes. It was a nightmare. But looking at that, and he wrote a letter at that time about sort of needing the books to be available at different price points, because the different price points are different products, right? And those are for different people. And that was something I had not thought about, right? But this was, I'd had this sense already that I was writing faster than traditional publishing could keep up with. Right. I had these big novels, but I was doing them fast enough that and my editor at the time was very, very slow in getting back to me, which is, talking about the agent not answering emails is like a job requirement in traditional publishing. It's very rare when people answer emails, unless you are somebody, in which case then it gets more common. But I realized I needed to do these novellas, and novellas are in like a weird gray area where most of traditional publishing is not interested in them at all. And most agents don't even necessarily represent them. And so my agent does not represent anything that's not a novel. And so anything I write that's not a novel, I could do whatever I want with, and like she's totally cool with that. And so I started doing the novellas on the side as sort of a supplemental thing, because traditional publishing also pays really irregularly. This is like another big difference. If you are putting something on Amazon, you're getting paid monthly, which is really nice. Traditional publishing will pay you twice a year. So I get paid about now and in about October. And then whenever I have a new book delivered, right, I hand in a manuscript, they pay me. So it's a very hard thing to sort of budget off of. So it's harder to plan your household expenses if you want to be a working writer, if you're traditionally published, because you get money every 6 months and you don't know what it's going to be necessarily, unless you happen to be with a really, really big publisher. I think so. Penguin has you can see your numbers and it'll give you estimates of what your income is, the way Amazon does. But if you're smaller than that, I have no clue what I'm getting when I get these checks now.
Nerve-wracking.
It's what's it going to be? Is it going to be $0? Is it going to be 5 figures? Who knows, right? And so that could be sort of a difficulty too, is sort of the financial angle. But they just don't know. They don't know how to make things a success, and they don't have the manpower to do it, because what they usually end up doing, traditional publishers, as far as like supporting authors goes, is they try really, really hard, within reason, when it's someone's first book. But if it doesn't work, if all that pushing didn't get you over the hill on the first book, they will probably let book 2 just go and see what happens. Because they need to move on to the next new author that they acquired and try to push that person to see if they are the Aragon, right? Because they just don't know. And so they'll reserve most of their effort for known quantities and for debut novels. And if you're writing book 3 in a 4-book contract, and they might not do anything for you, actually.
Question. So you've done both, Christopher, and you seem to have a pretty unique vantage point in terms of understanding both worlds. What would stop you from just going indie at this point? I know that's not like even on your mind at all. But what is it that's keeping you in traditional publishing?
The big thing is general readers, right? Because now, like, more and more people are engaged, right, with independent publishing and are sort of open to it than ever before. But there's still a sizable proportion of people who have no idea it even exists, and who really only look at books if they do happen to go by a bookstore, right? Or their friend tells them, and then they like go to a bookstore because like they don't even think to look on Amazon for books because that's where they get toilet paper, right? Like that, and that is actually like most people right now. That sounds crazy, like talking on a YouTube channel, about books run by an author to like two other authors with like people who are, have TBR piles, right? But most readers don't have TBR piles, actually,
That's
right? And I and maybe this is vice, but like I want as many people as possible to read the book. So it feels useful to me as like one sort of part of my ship here to have a foot in this world, because I want to be able to reach as many people as possible, and this is still a tool to do that. And there is that sense of legitimacy too, right? That sense of prestige that again is mostly for like the more casual, right? The reader, the more likely they are to view New York publishing as like publishing, right? And so it's useful to do all these different things. I sort of think about building my audience in terms of concentric circles, right? And the people who buy the diamond editions are like right here, right in the middle. Those are my homies, right? Hi everybody in the chat. But then, because like there are people who've bought the book like 5 times, which is a completely like incomprehensible thing to me. Well, maybe not. I bought Dune 4 times, so it's close. But then you move out, right? And you have to do different things as a writer for like the people in each circle, right? And so like a thing I would love to do for the people in like that furthest out circle, right? The like potential new reader, Barnes and Noble window shopper, is like get the hardcovers back in print, right? And now now that's difficult because I don't have the control over this, right? Like Nicholas was talking about, that is up to my publisher. But like that's a thing that could happen out there that would be useful to grab readers there. But the readers that are sort of in the inner more circles need things like novellas written and special editions, right? And very fancy special editions and YouTube live streams, right? And so I sort of think about like, what do I need to do to hit this part of the bullseye and this part of the bullseye and that part of the bullseye? And being traditionally published is for that outermost circle, right? Is something I think that's going to help me grab the most people, because if you're in your position, Jordan, and you're that was not the best place to put my hand. But if you're in your position, Jordan, and you're trying to decide what you want to do with this book that you've written, and you decide to do indie, right? You are contributing one drop of water to a much larger pool at this point, right? And so there's a degree to which it makes sense, if you're a debut writer, to try for trad first anyway, just to get your name into the conversation. And then maybe later, especially the way things keep changing, maybe you do segue into doing, indie exclusively, or you segue into doing, at least some hybrid stuff. I guess I would call I am a hybrid writer, right? I do some independent stuff, but that's usually to supplement the traditional stuff, right? So
Okay.
when I move on to another series, whatever that may be, the independently published stuff will probably shift to covering whatever the new stuff is. Now, Sun Eater is not going anywhere. Nobody needs to have a heart attack. But so I'll do support for that there too. But for me, like the core stuff goes to traditional publishing because that's what I'm trying to grab new people with, and then the stuff I'm independently publishing is support for the people who are already here. Because the thing about independent publishing too is like it doesn't take a year for the thing to come out, right? I started writing The Dregs of Empire in April. I finished it in June, and it was out in November. And it could have been faster, but I also had a baby, and that slowed me down a little bit. But yeah. So,
question for both of you. Then, just going off of that, do you guys feel, and especially you can speak to this, Nicholas, do you feel that an indie book goes through the necessary edits and revisions? I imagine part of the benefit of traditional publishing is that they really hammer away at that book until it's, as good as it can be. I was going to say perfect, but
you would think so. You would think so, but that depends on the editor, right, Christopher? I mean, I've heard some pretty bad horror stories from traditionally published authors who are considered to be really big in their respective fields. That some of the recent layoffs have given rise to a new crop of editors that need a bit of training before they can get to the level of the previous generation. But just to quickly answer. From my perspective, Jordan, it really depends on the author and how much self-awareness the author has. The indie author is somebody who recognizes that they're in this for the long haul. Then they can do one of two things. The school of Dean Wesley Smith is use a copy editor, but not a developmental editor, and don't spend too much money on proofreading, but just focus on the copy edits because those are the things that go by you. Things that are structurally unsound, repeating words, inconsistent themes, inconsistent motivations and characters, stuff like this. It's line editing, right? Not like the big developmental edits that you probably get, especially if you're a newer writer in the traditional houses. And basically, he says you do that for a while, and then you stop doing that completely, and you just publish and let the market determine whether or not you wrote something good. I'm not of that. I think that's a little too crazy. I think it's if you can find the right. The trick is if you can find the right editor, because it used to be that there was a kind of pipeline, right? You had people that cultivated the art of editing. They were really good at what they did, and they were long-standing editors in publishing houses, but they're expensive. And there's been a lot of layoffs now, and so now it's a bit more of a crapshoot. I'll say for myself that I spend time and energy finding editors that I work with well, but also that I recognize make my writing better. So there are plenty of self-published authors that don't put in the money or the effort, and that's to their detriment. And their books are the worst for it, and they don't sell. So
yeah. But the short answer is you can. There are freelance editors, and there are some of them. Are editors that traditional publishers use too, because they often, especially some of the, I don't want to say smaller traditional publishers, it's not exactly right, but maybe newer ones, places like Blackstone. I think Blackstone mostly uses freelance developmental editors. I might be wrong about that, but it is done. When Dave Butler edited Disquiet Gods, Dave is not on staff. He's paid freelance. Okay. And a lot of those roles in traditional publishing have moved to freelance anyway. Copy editors, like nobody employs a copy editor full time anymore, so far as I know.
You have AI doing that stuff anyway.
That's also true. That's a whole nother kettle of sand trout. But proofreaders have all moved out of house too. Cover designers often have moved out of house. So often, traditional publisher staff is 2 to 3 developmental editors, and those are the people who not only are editing the books but will pick the books, right? They will talk to the agents. The agents will say, hey, I got this really cool epic fantasy novel by this guy Jordan Hill. You should totally read it. It reminds me of X, Y, and Z for reasons A, B, and C. Give me money. And so in a perfect world, they read it and they say, "Hey, this is great. We will give you money." And but that's sort of the model. Sorry, I got distracted by the chat. Which I will we'll get to in a second. Which reminds me, if you guys do have questions about publishing, by all means, do drop them in the chat. I saw there are a couple of questions that are more about me. I'll get to those when we hit a lull. Yeah. So where was I? Right. So the editors will also be picking the books. But then it'll be them, and they'll have like a production department, which is like the guy or the lady whose job it is to sort of make sure everything is on time, and make sure that the jobbers, right, the freelancers, get stuff done, in a certain way. But and to schedule. But it's usually just, like I said, like maybe 3 people, in editorial, like 3 people in production, and maybe like 1 or 2 marketing guys, and that's like really all the a company the size of something like Dollar Bane really needs. The bigger you get, obviously there are more people, right? If you're talking about like Tor certainly has more people, but if you want to get out of science fiction, like obviously Simon and Schuster has like way more people because they're trying to do a lot more stuff at once.
Follow up for you, Nicholas. Did you say that you think for an indie author, especially like a new indie author, that you think a copy editor is more important? Because I'll just say really quickly, I'm writing my book with my wife, and we're kind of going half and half on it. And so we catch each other's like copy edit errors kind of thing. And when I go back and do edits and rereads, I almost never spot any kind of typo or anything like that. When we're pretty precise, she's a college professor and I'm a high school English teacher. And so we're pretty precise on anything like that. But for me, I feel like I need someone to tell me, cut this chapter out, it's dragging, because I'm in love with the chapter I just wrote. It's my baby. And I find it to be really interesting, this like Nietzschean observation that my villain just made. But like, maybe like, an ordinary reader is going to find that clunky and heavy handed. I just need someone to tell me, I feel like, this story isn't flowing, it's dragging, it's a slog in this part. And I feel like I don't so much need a copy editor. Did you hire a developmental editor?
I did.
Just a copy editor?
No, I hired a developmental editor for my first few novels. What I realized for myself, now I have to be clear, I'm always working on studying the craft and training and making sure that I'm learning about all those things that you're talking about. And I'm reading a lot, and I'm honing my skills as an author constantly, not just in the process of writing the novels, but outside of that as well. It's very important for me, and I think it's important for any writer who wants to be in it for the long haul. You have to constantly be working on the craft, because you can never learn too much. It's really incredible what some of the technical masters do, and you can't even see the stuff that they do until you really start studying it and you realize, oh my God, what on earth did I just read? Most readers will just be submerged in it and think that was great, but won't understand what's going on. So I did use a developmental editor. What I realized though is that the more I studied and the more that I'm a very intuitive writer, so this also helps. Not everybody is intuitive, but as somebody who reads a lot, who watches a lot of movies and thinks about things like structure and stuff like this is part of my creative process, not just my critical process. I realized that although the stuff that the developmental editor was giving me was really useful, I would have gotten there anyway if I had taken the time and the energy to actually do it. So I was trading money for time. And at a certain point, developmental editors are very expensive. So at a certain point, it became just very clear to me that I don't need to spend that much money on somebody who's going to be telling me stuff about that I will probably figure out on my own. And this is the big if. You have to work on your self-awareness, right? And that's hard. But this is why you have things like beta readers. Beta readers that you trust can be very helpful in that, and they're free. And if you can cultivate well, that sounded pretty terrible.
I'm only laughing because I have this exact anxiety all the time. I'm like, I should like get you guys something.
Yes. Free gifts. Yes.
How do you find a beta reader, Nicholas, that will tell you the truth? you know, I'll have someone like Christopher Ruocchio, and I'll have him read a couple of chapters, and he'll be like, "Yeah, it's great," but I don't know if I can trust Christopher Ruocchio because he's my buddy, you know, and he'll just tell me it's great. That's kind of how I feel.
I would have
Yeah,
told
well,
you if it sucked. Actually, there's some people, you know, I will not tell the truth to because I don't trust them to not take it too personally.
Yeah.
But man, I didn't lie to you, Jordan. I liked it a lot, actually. I thought that first chapter was great.
I could see it in your eyes, Christopher.
There's a shifty look there. Yeah.
Well, I keep forgetting my camera is over here now. Changed the setup, so the actual webcam is a dummy. No, I'm using my phone now so that the chat will stop yelling at me for my terrible video. So
I mean, how do you find good beta readers? There's an element of luck. I've been very lucky because I've always been surrounded by a nurturing community of authors that I looked for, and I found, and some of them are my mentors, and some of them have extended networks of very good readers that they brought along with them. So I don't know if it's something that in my case I could sort of give you a 1, 2, you know, a stepwise kind of process, but maybe there's a general principle to be taken out of that, and that's if you have a student's mindset, you will always be looking for someone to be a mentor, no matter how successful or how good you become, and those people are out there, and they're oftentimes very willing to help. And through them, they have their own networks and they can recommend people as well. Also, you will get to a point, if you publish enough books, that some readers will kind of stand out from the crowd. And a lot of readers don't mind personal contact with authors. In fact, they like it a lot. Authors think that it's creepy that there's this like closeness in the internet age, and the readers love it. So if you can get past the initial kind of, oh my gosh, is this okay? There's some readers who are regulars, and especially if you go so far as to set up a Patreon page or some, you know, sort of super fan type things, they come out of the woodwork and they'll be more than willing to help you out. And a lot of those people, you can read their reviews of other authors and you can see they're exactly the kind of person you need, because they'll be saying things like, my attention lagged at page 45, and at which point you're like, okay, get over here. Like, please read my book here, it's free, you know. And because you have some whale readers, some super readers that are so attuned to the currents of modern fiction that they're even better than editors, because they're on the receiving end as the people who actually enjoy it, not the people who are being paid for it. So if you can find a few of those, they can be just invaluable. And I've been very lucky. I've been able to find a few of them.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I was talking to one of my editors at one of the big houses I work with, and she was talking about. I don't know if she would want me to say who it was. So, but anyway, so she was talking about how, like, the longer you work in publishing, like, you only really read for work anymore, right? Which is sort of my experience too. Like, is I only read when I basically only read fiction now when it's because someone asked me to do a blurb, basically, or tell them their first chapter was good when it wasn't. Just kidding, Jordan. No, Jordan, I really did love it, man. Actually, like, for real. But you're being so nervous. But because of this, they do kind of get, like, removed from reality and, like, up some sort of weird right angle, because they're not really interacting with a representative sample of what is anymore. Yeah. And that, like, deforms a lot of that deforms people, right? In the same way that, like, famous people get sort of deformed about how to use a grocery store because they don't have to anymore. How much could a banana cost, Michael? $10. And there's a similar effect on sort of their sort of editorial instincts that can happen sometimes if that's, like, their full-time job. Yeah. And so I will second the beta readers thing. If you can find a good one, and even like one is really, really helpful. I have Casey, if you're here, Casey volunteered to reread all of my independently published stuff and fix my typos and continuity errors because he was bored. And I really don't pay you enough, Casey. Sometimes these people do show up, and I still have, like, friends from my, like, college writing classes that were also in class, were in class with me, and I kept writing, and they got regular jobs because they're smarter than I am. And they'll still read stuff occasionally. You can't obviously expect people to necessarily show up when you need them to with beta readers, of course, right? Because they're doing it as a hobby, and usually because they like what you're writing, but what you're writing is probably not as important to them as it is to you sometimes. Although sometimes it's more important, which is very strange. It's a very strange relationship. People are always mystified when you're like, you changed something, and I'm like, well, it needed to be changed. I'm like, you can't just do that.
Right. Yeah.
It's interesting because the writing is like a very different thing to readers than it is to writers.
Oh,
has
yeah,
been my
totally.
experience. But that's like also true for editors, though. Is the thing.
I've also heard horror stories of editors like breaking the wills of writers just because they had a bad day or they were having a bad year or a bad whatever, and it's some passion project for the writer, and the writer has had a good experience with the editor before, and for whatever reason the editor just doesn't jive with the thing, and rather than just doing the proper thing and say this isn't for me, they'll try to make it into the thing that they want it to be. And that's always a temptation, right? Especially if you have a job and you're expected to produce, sell. And I've heard of several of those cases, and for me that is the scariest thing that I can imagine, is that somebody takes this, put so much into, and just almost on a whim will just start hacking the thing to pieces. And I've also heard plenty of situations where writers have ignored the advice of their editors and then gone on to be fabulously successful. But then again, there's also J.K. Rowling and George R.R. Martin who stopped listening to their editors, and their novel started to do this. So yeah, it's a nuance.
Well, and sometimes it works, right? 'Cause the thing about like the editor relationship in traditional publishing, right, is that I think from the outside people imagine that it's basically like author hands thing in, editor says this is broken in these ways, go fix it or I will, right? And that is usually not the experience, even with editors who are not Maxwell Perkins, right? Who are not like the best editor of all time, right? And even in his case, like he was pretty didactic, right? Like he would push his authors pretty hard to be not their natural selves in certain ways, right? Ideally what happens, right, is the editor will come back with a letter and some notes and some line comments and things, and you'll talk about those. And even if you don't have to take all of those suggestions. It behooves you as a writer to like be in this sort of negotiation with them and say, hey, these things make sense. I don't agree with you on that one, but maybe I'll take your criticism of this episode, but not your prescription for how to change it. And like, I'll ignore these things. Because I would do this pretty frequently. I would say, hey, I hear you on like A, C, and Q, but D and F I'm not doing anything about. And then like I wouldn't even like mention that I'm ignoring her on H, right? I'm just like, that one we're just gonna leave it there, and if they catch it on like the second read, then like maybe I'm just like, oh, I forgot about that, right? Because the reality is often like some of those things just won't be checked again, right? And so
nobody's got the time, right?
Not every editor is going to put 11 reads into a book, and like most books don't financially like justify the editor doing that, right? If it's like George Martin or Pat Rothfuss, right, like an editor, like it would behoove them to make sure that book is literally perfect when it comes out, right? But if it's most books, they can sort of get by with like one, maybe two passes, and because like the other thing that like needs to be said in almost defense of traditional publishing, right, is that like the goals of the publisher are to stay in business as a publisher, right, and not to support the outcomes of any individual author. Now that doesn't mean that like they should just throw authors to the wolves necessarily. Although sometimes it does mean like we can't allocate enough attention to this person, right? We need to like focus all of our efforts over here. And this is true of like spending money on advances even, right? Like, well, we would really like to have that book, but we can only pay 10 grand for it, right? Because we're paying $500,000 to keep this New York Times bestseller happy or whatever, right? So they have to make all of these sort of meta judgments as a company sort of despite the individual interests of any given author, whereas you, whether you're a traditionally published author or independently, like need to worry about like what's going on with you like at all times, right? And so if you're maybe listening and you're tempted to go to traditional publishing because you think, hey, they're gonna solve all my problems for me, they will not actually. Like nobody in publishing, traditional, independent or otherwise, is going to care about your books more than you do, with the exception of like those like super fans. Like just that's the only group, right? And they can't like make your business decisions for you, right? And so like I've been in this position constantly where I've had to like be really, really annoying to my agents, to my publishers for years to get things to happen. And like that is, Nicholas, I know you're like, why don't you just self-publish it, man? Like you would have to deal with this, right? And you're like, not wrong. But there's like I said, there is a plan, right? And there's a vision, and like to make these things happen, sometimes you have to, at least in traditional publishing, you have to shake these cages a little bit. And if you're a person who's not willing to do that, then definitely like don't try.
Well, and things seem to be actually on the verge of some major changes. I don't know if Christopher, if you've been paying attention to something called Authors Equity. But there's a new publishing house out there. It's funded by people like James Clear and Tim Ferriss. And the idea here is that there are no advances. The authors bring the audience. So these are major authors with huge audiences who you would think would be perfectly okay with either doing traditional or indie. Because if they do traditional, they're going to get all the attention because these guys have multi-million, huge audiences. Or they're going to just do the indie thing because they could hire somebody to do it for them and make tons of money off of the royalties. But this new model is a zero advance model with a much higher percentage of royalties given to authors. And it's a small select group of people. It's run by former CEOs of major publishing companies. And equity, the idea being that it's more equitable for the author. So they're getting rid of the kind of the silent killer in the room, which is the whole idea of the advance being a kind of the thing that holds everybody back because you have to pay back the royalties. And it in some ways it makes a lot of sense. I think there might be a future for this kind of model where advances go away and royalties start coming up for the author, so that then both the author and the publisher have more skin in the game. Especially if there still continues to be this kind of emphasis on launches as being the thing that determines whether or not a book is successful, which I'm not sure if that's ever going to go away because it's kind of baked into the culture.
Yeah, and that's sort of the box office mentality that people have, which is very strange because like the reality is that books are not movies, right? And what really like if you're a traditionally published author, you have like two paths to success, right? And one of them is to like write one book that sells 1 million copies, and to like become instantly famous.
Yes.
And the other one is to write like 100 books that do okay.
Yes.
And like those stack up, and like that is a way more reliable way to have a career in traditional publishing still. Like I feel like that's sort of my track because as the books have gone through, as my advances have earned out, right, those semi-annual payments keep getting bigger, and like that's nice, right? And the theory is that will like continue, right? And that would be better. I think it might be helpful for anybody who's listening if you don't know. Basically, I should like talk about traditional publishing, like how they pay you, right? I made a video about this like years ago, but it's I had my really bad camera, so nobody would watch it, I'm sure. But what happens basically is if you have an agent, your agent gets you your contract, and they'll say, hey, we're going to pay you X dollars like right now. And usually that's broken up into chunks. You'll get someone you sign the contract with, someone you hand in the manuscript, someone the book comes out. And sometimes they'll fractionate that, and it'll be sometimes when the hardcover comes out, sometimes when the paperback comes out. And the theory there is that way you're not getting paid all at once, and you don't like one, you don't blow through it, and two, the publisher doesn't have to like nuke their own bank accounts to give you this giant lump sum at once, right?
Yep.
That's the theory. The reality is that it just like space out your payments. It's like it can be pretty tough if you're slow maybe delivering. But that is against the books that you'll eventually sell. So if you get $10,000 say, and you get they'll have your books, they pay back 10% of whatever the sticker price is per copy sold, right? So say it's $40 book, right? That's obviously quite high, but say it's $40 book, right? Then you get $4 a book, and that'll come out of that 10,000 until you hit 10,000, and then they'll start giving you money for all of the books after that. That's basically how it works. You sort of go from there. So as the books stack up, you'll get reports for each book, and hopefully you'll get money for each of them, and it'll snowball is the theory. So that's basically so those are royalties, right? The royalty is the percentage of the sticker price that authors are getting. So I figured I should define some terms for people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's how traditional publishing pays. There are it's not just this author equity people. There are publishers that are starting to move to a zero advance, higher royalty percentage model. One of my UK publishers gives me no advance, but is closer to Amazon percentages than to traditional publishing. And there are a lot of the newer, smaller companies are opening up doing that. I know Athon Books will publish that way. They'll give someone no money up front, but 35% per copy sold, which is a pretty good deal. If you can move volume, right? You're getting sometimes 3 to 4 times what you would get off of say a deal with 10% for a hardcover is pretty standard. Now here's an interesting question here. There are a couple here in the chat we should go back through real quick. This is actually useful. Sort of touches on the tragedy problem we started out talking about. But Arjun asks, will I consider publishing a hardcover set of all my books? I would love to, but I do not have the ability to make that choice. That's something that my publisher has to decide. If it were up to me, they'd be available now. But traditional publishing, they have to batch print the books in lots, because the more they print at once, the cost per copy to get printed, right, goes down, and so their margins or profit margins get better. So if they print 5,000, that's better than printing 1,000, because even if the sticker price is the same, because they'll get a bigger cut per copy. And basically, my publisher does not believe that they could sell 5,000 or 10,000 copies, so they don't want to print them. That is the situation they're in. I have been trying to convince them that they're probably wrong for years now, especially as things are getting better. My odds of convincing them have improved, but we're not quite there yet. So
if a number of reviews is a proxy for number of sales, then that should be enough reason for you to be able to convince them, because you're clearly, the number of reviews that you have right now, especially after the Daniel Green effect, it's impressive. So I don't understand what they're thinking.
Yeah, well, they're thinking. So we'll see what happens. But it isn't up to me fundamentally. So if you don't want to be stuck, unable to make these decisions, you should not traditionally publish, right? Because this is something I can't induce them to go print books. That's up to them, right? Steve, I'm pretty sure this is a joke. When will I announce the Subterranean Press editions? I already have 3 special editions. We're good. We're good. But Sam asked, this was the question that caught my eye. I know Christopher, you edited a lot of anthologies for Baen. How do those generally sell? Is there a high market for short story anthologies? Not in traditional publishing. Those are almost always Vanity Project is maybe an unkind way to put it, but very often the anthologies I was editing for Baen were mostly reprints, and we were mostly interested in finding classic stories by classic writers to get them back into print, sometimes for the first time, because we felt like that was a good thing to do culturally. This is sort of one of Baen's ongoing projects, is just finding old science fiction stories and reprinting them. Sometimes they'll barely break even. Some of those anthologies may not have earned out at all, but those reprint anthologies in particular was sort of a cultural project. And it was a good thing to do, and it was a fun thing to do. But anthologies are a little bit better over on the indie side of things, depending on how you do it. And short story collections, which a collection is a bunch of stories by one author, an anthology has multiple authors, right? Collections are sort of better across the board anyway, assuming it's an author people want to read, right? So because they're going for the one author, because readers follow authors fundamentally. And the theory with the anthologies is, they'll buy the story because Christopher put a story in that, they'll buy it for that, and then they'll read all the other stories. Well, the reality is they might leaf through the book in the store and read my story, right? But then they don't buy the book. or they'll buy it and they'll only read one story, and so the crossover effect is pretty minimal.
Mhm.
And this only really works anyway if the tentpole author in the anthology is George Martin or Patrick Rothfuss or
That's right.
something like that. So people are buying it for Game of Thrones, and like, hey, if you happen to get in that book, good for you. You got some extra money. But I did a couple like indie like ebook anthologies that did really well. I was in them. I did edit them. There's one I still get paid for. It's like 5 years old. So
Really? Wow.
yeah, Jim Butcher did a story, and it was the secret there.
Nice.
But um, but it's a little bit more viable over on that side anyway, because if you're making more, per copy sold, right, then selling fewer of them isn't a big issue. I know there are a lot of these small presses that do their sort of shared universe, and like the company's job is really to make the universe, right? They've got their own little private personal Star Wars, and they'll put out an anthology that ties the books together or something like that. Those do okay. But if you try to just traditionally publish like Dangerous Visions 4 or something like that, I don't think it's gonna take off the way they used to. So good question though, Sam. Let's see. Sharang has a question here. I had to skip out. Just got back. Don't know if someone asked this, but how does an indie author even get seen with their first book? That's a great question.
Yeah, you can't assume that that's going to happen. In fact, it's more likely than not going to happen. So because it's just the internet is a fire hose of information. So the issue, of course, is visibility, and the secret sauce for any kind of entertainment on the internet is discoverability, and nobody has figured out the magic fairy dust for how to leverage discoverability. So the only way you can get discovered is if you have volume, or if you happen to catch a wave, or if somebody pushes you, right? So one book, you just pretty much are going to assume that nothing's going to happen, and you put it out, you use it as a training ground to navigate the waters of how this thing even happens, like how you put it onto a how you put it onto a retailer. What do you do with metadata? What kind of these are very technical terms, but when you become a publisher, you have to think about these sorts of things, and kind of put it out there and see what happens. If nothing happens, it doesn't mean anything, because most people won't even look at an author that has only one book out, because not only is it against you that you're not traditionally published, which they might look at you if you're a one book author traditionally published because you've gone through a gatekeeper. They're not going to look at you if you're a one book author indie, especially if you're writing in series, because there's no guarantee that you're ever going to get to the end of the series. Because a lot of indie authors do this. They'll test the waters. They'll write 1 or 2 or 3 books in a 5-book series, and they won't finish it because there's not enough readership, which is terrible, because most of the time you need to write something like 5-10 books before people start paying attention. That being said, there are other ways you can get attention, Kickstarter being one of them. Kickstarter doesn't care how many books you've published. If you have a premisey book, a book that's really exciting in terms of its idea, in terms of its premise, in terms of some visuals that you have, in terms of something that has to have some sort of a hook, you can get Kickstarter's attention. I'll just tell you, just recently, I'm about to finish tomorrow morning is ending my latest Kickstarter campaign on something that shouldn't be selling. It's a 3-volume set of translated Russian fairy tales, and it's almost at 45K. So what happened? Probably there's some combination of really good copy, very vivid visuals, and a good video. So, and the reason that I think that's what happened is because most of the people that signed up for that Kickstarter are people that have never heard of me, and I can tell because of the information that Kickstarter gives me. These are people that Kickstarter itself suggested the page to, and they said, yes, I like this. So you can have the kind of success on one book if it's an idea that stands out, and if you have the ability yourself to create some beautiful visuals, or to create a good video, or to write good copy, or if you have friends that do that well, or if you have money to pay for specialists who are able to do that really well. I have a great copywriter that I pay as my assistant and a video guy, so I wouldn't have been able to do that myself. So it's hard, but again, it's kind of a flip in terms of the expectations, if in traditional publishing, it's all about the launch and it's all about the big numbers at the very beginning, your first book has to sell. Otherwise, like Christopher said, otherwise forget it. Nobody's going to pay attention to you. In indie, it's the opposite. Like nobody expects you to do anything with book one, but if you stick with it and if you continue to work it and if you continue to do the things necessary as a publisher to start getting eyeballs to yourself and to your book, then by book 5, 6, you might have enough people that it becomes a sustainable thing. And I mean, for me, I'm in year 6 and I'm not just sustainable. I'm doing really well. So it's totally possible. And I haven't written that many books and it's in a niche that's not particularly lucrative. So it's possible.
Yeah, because when you're talking about audience sizes, you know, in the like 1,000, 2,000 reader range, right? There are that many people for basically anything, right? It's a question of finding them. Yeah, exactly. It's a question of finding them. And another thing that, you know, that is maybe helpful, and this is true if you're like a new trad writer too, right? Is to have some sort of platform. Because of course, publishers will look for people who have them in the first place. It like is a thing that they consider when they're looking at like, do we want to sign this person, right? Yeah. It's like, well, do they come with an audience? Man, that's helpful. You know, when Bain signed Leary Korea, he already had like 10,000 people who frequented his blog. It was pretty famous on the internet in I think it was gun circles. Right, and so he came with this big audience, right? And so long as there's a crossover between the people who are enjoying you for whatever the platform is, right, and whatever you're writing, that's fine. It's one of the reasons I didn't want to make my YouTube channel about reviewing books and have made it instead like very specifically about my own work, is because I figured if I was reviewing other people's books, it would be less about my stuff, less about me. Now, you know, if you're Brian Lee Durfee, you can make it work. You remind everybody what your books are before every video, and it becomes a meme, right? When it could have, like, if like I'm not Brian, like if I tried to be Brian, I think it would be annoying if I reminded everybody, you know, and you know, before I was doing a video about Lord of the Rings or like, hey, I'm gonna play Elden Ring, you know, I think people would be like, why are you reminding us about your dumb books? Just play the game, slave. And so if you could find a way to make the platform sort of synchronize with what you're doing, right? You know, I think that can be really, really helpful. I'm not saying like make a YouTube channel necessarily, but there are like other things that you can do on the internet.
It also depends on the kind of personality you are when it comes to your willingness and comfort to do the publishing thing. Because you know, the writing thing is, you know, let's just put that aside. You have to become a good writer. It takes a long time, takes a lot of practice, it takes a lot of training, it takes blood, sweat, and tears. It takes, you know, butt and chair. It's hard, and nothing is going to make that part easier. But you, as writers, we love that because you can, you know, because it's wonderful when you get to the part where the thing happens and you realize the story you've been writing actually makes sense. It's one of the most incredible experiences ever. But as a publisher, you have a lot of different ways that you can engage people's attention. And it's absolutely true that if you're the kind of person that is engaging enough outside of just your writing, but have some kind of interest when it comes to a larger, wider worldview or current issues, or you're an activist, or you just have a really interesting kind of take on the world. Somebody like Neil Gaiman. Like Neil Gaiman writes across all kinds of genres, but everybody recognizes a Neil Gaiman book not because of genre, but because of Neil Gaiman. And he can write a blog post. He can show up, talk you know, mythology at the local college, and it's going to be packed every time, right? Because it's Neil Gaiman. He has the kind of persona and personality and attraction that people just gravitate to him as a writer, not just to his books. So if you're that kind of writer, that's one way of getting the attention of readers, and you can leverage that in a lot of interesting ways. Other people don't want that kind of thing. That to them, that's like worse than the ninth circle of hell. And if you're perhaps somebody who writes really fast and understands tropes really well, then you don't have to show up in front of anybody ever. All you need to do is write into tropes and publish on Amazon, and Amazon's algorithm will do it for you. If I did that, I would die. I would shrivel up on the inside, and I would never write another word because I can't write into tropes like that. That's not how I do that.
Yeah. I have a friend who does that, and it is killing him. He is not temperamentally inclined to it, but it's the only thing he's written that sells. So he's like,
I mean, that's the tricky bit. And unfortunately, so much of indie up to probably about the last few years or so has been geared almost exclusively on that kind of model, which is volume publishing, publish a book a month, make sure it's as close to skewing trends as it possibly can be, and then ride the wave and hope that the algorithm doesn't push you down, which of course it will, which is why you have to keep publishing. And there's a lot of burnout in the indie author community right now because of that. But the industry is becoming mature. So there are people who are sort of author advocates who are looking at the indie publishing space from a distance, and they're very convincingly showing that there's actually different paths that you can take, that the volume path, which is very lucrative for some people, is one way, but you can do a completely different way. Like for me, for example, I'm very focused on craft, which for me doesn't necessarily mean the craft of writing, but it means the craft of creating something that is a beautiful object. So I will publish fewer books, but I will spend a lot of time crafting things around the book, making special editions, making musical accompaniment to it, creating journals, creating artwork around it, like just making the whole experience a kind of thing that people can really focus in on the beauty of the process and the beauty of the actual finished product. And that becomes premium for some people, and they're willing to pay a lot more for the experience as well as the book. So that's a different way of doing it. And yet a third way is for some people who are very good at social media and are good at YouTube and things like this, where it's all about engagement with fans, and then the engagement becomes the vehicle for creating the thing, and the fans tell you what they want and you give it to them, and they become very grateful. And so that's yet a third way of doing it, all three of which are completely different, based on completely different kind of archetypes when it comes to your personality and how you do sales and marketing. And every single one of those can become very successful if you do it consistently.
Okay, question for you, Nicholas, here. I haven't read your books yet. They sound really fascinating. And I imagine that someone like you, if you're doing translated Russian fairy tales,
yeah,
and you're compiling them like that, like some Russian Andrew Lang or something
yeah,
like
well, exactly.
that.
Yeah.
I imagine that that's a specialty item that people are actually looking for, which makes it easier for you to do a Kickstarter for something like that. I imagine that for someone like me, not many people have heard of me, and I'm just another guy writing another fantasy book. I imagine that wouldn't do very well with Kickstarter. What do you think about that sort of thing?
You're thinking along the right lines, and it's exactly the kind of thing that I would have thought was true. If that were the case, though, then I would have spent all my energy on this particular Kickstarter that I'm running right now, creating a single volume that's hardcover, that's fully illustrated, that has specialty paper, Smith binding, like maybe even like a special slipcase for the single volume, and price it at $100 and make it like a limited edition kind of thing. Exactly the sort of thing Christopher did, which is something I hope to do eventually, but that's super expensive to plan out. And especially the kind of illustration that I'm thinking of, it's going to be just absurd. So I had these fairy tales lying around because I have a podcast where I retell the fairy tales to musical accompaniment. And this is just IP that wasn't being used in a print sense. So I just compiled it and thought, why not just kind of do a simple thing with a nice, pretty cover that I had somebody design, kind of put it out there and see what happens. I expected it to get a few $1,000, but this thing is the most lucrative thing that I've ever made on Kickstarter. So you never know. You never know what little hook is going to grab people. And what's great about Kickstarter is you have people who are willing to spend a premium on an idea, not necessarily on an object. So what I would say to you, Jordan, is that I think the best thing you can do is to figure out what is that very unique premise that sets apart your fantasy novel from everything else. And everybody has that. The trick is figuring it out and talking about it in a way that grabs people's attention. And I mean, it doesn't even have to be the book. Last year, or now a year and a half ago, I did a Christmas Kickstarter where the hook wasn't the book. It was the idea of presenting a book-related gift to people to celebrate Jólabókaflóð, which is an Icelandic tradition of reading an entire book over the night of Christmas Eve. And there's a whole great story that's connected with this. It has to do with World War II, when everything was rationed, and the only thing that people could give to each other is paper, so books that were repurposed. And it became this Icelandic tradition that has a great kind of hygge element to it that always gets people's attention. Anything that's, that's wintry and cozy, and has, you can put pictures with lights and people drinking coffee, and you got them, right? And so it wasn't even the book at that point; it was the idea of selling this experience of being able to have a small book that you can read in a single evening, and providing them with some other things as well. I gave them a specially designed throw. And I didn't get the mug. I should have. If I had gotten the mug, it would have been even more successful. And put it all in its fancy box. I mean, people loved it. The experience of having this, taste of Christmas given to them. So most people don't have the energy or the time to just dedicate to figure out that little bit of magic that can attract people. And the thing is, people on Kickstarter and platforms like this, they're not like editors at publishers. That they don't have their filters on, right? They're not constantly saying, "Oh, that's not good enough. Let me go on to the next thing." They're there because they want to buy, right? So they're much more likely to try out things that are weird and different. So if you can figure out something that just catches their attention, catches their imagination, that's either connected with your book or maybe connected with the world around the book. It might be the world building. It might be, or maybe you have a talent that's outside of just book writing. Maybe there's something you can do who was it? Kevin J. Anderson did a series of epic fantasy novels where he commissioned a rock album to go with it. And it's the greatest idea ever. Why not? Why not have a rock album that, I'm not saying
it helps when you're friends with Neil Peart, right?
No, that was a different one. So he did. Yeah. No,
one.
That was one of his more recent ones. And that was a hugely successful one because Neil Peart died. So, if you have a rock star that dies, that's your friend. That's another, that's a terrible thing to say, but that's going to be a very successful Kickstarter. I'm sorry. That's terrible. No, but this is an old series they wrote in the 90s. And
okay. I missed this. I haven't talked to Kevin in a couple of years.
Yeah. He's great. Kevin's great.
Yeah.
Well, can I, one more, Nicholas, one more question. I'm just curious about all this. So I was looking at your Amazon page and I was, I'm probably going to buy those Russian fairy tale books. They just sound great. And my wife loves fairy tales. They're
a lot of fun. Yeah.
Every collection that you can think of. But I also saw your 5-book series. It was Raven's Son or something like that.
That's the one. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to know what that process was like, publishing on Amazon, getting your books on Audible. I know from doing a podcast how easy it is actually to get your book or to get your stuff on Audible.
Yeah.
But just also, and so beyond the process of just working through Amazon, finding an audience initially with your Russian themed fantasy.
Yeah.
With all the saturation out there, did you find it difficult to carve your own path, or what was that like?
Yeah, it was. So if you look up anything related to Russian folk culture on Google, I'll show up. And it's a tiny niche. It's totally, insignificant, but I found it fascinating. And before I even published the book, I just started to blog about the all the cool stuff that happened in Russian history and Russian folklore. This is all stuff. I'm of Russian descent, so for me, this is like just stuff that I got with my mother's milk. I'm fluent in Russian, and I translate as a side job.
Do they read you in Russian? In Russia, do they read you?
Sorry?
Do you have an audience in Russia or?
I wish. That's a different question, actually. That's an interesting. You can ask me that later.
Okay.
I have a story about that, but right now, obviously not, because you can't sell anything to Russians.
Yeah.
Nothing will get published there unless you're a Russian, and they have a thing against Russian Americans right now because of the war. And there's a lot of kind of nationalistic feeling right now. So they're like, if you're over there, that means you're not one of us. So, but so I was just like going on Russian internet and translating like very SEO optimized articles, stuff like 7 mythical creatures you'll find in Russian fairy tale. Exactly the kind of things that Google loves. And it was a lot of fun to do, and it was quick and easy. And I hadn't published a book yet, so why not? This is basically research. It's like filling my mind with all of the images and all of the stories and all the stuff that I knew already, but I was refreshing myself for it. And then it ended up going into the stories as well. So that's only an added bonus. But it was a slow slog initially, but I got lucky. A lot of this always has to do with luck. which I don't really believe in. I think that things happen kind of providentially, if you can put it that way. It certainly was for me. I was put into a pilot program in 2018 for an early Kickstarter training program that was run by a company called InstaFreebie, which no longer exists. They're called something else now, but they were in the space of allowing authors to create freebies to give away to readers for the purposes of getting people on your mailing list. And I don't know how they got connected with Kickstarter directly, but they basically collected a group of, I think, 10 authors, and they gave them training from somebody who had just done a bunch of publishing Kickstarters in all the nuances of how to do it. So my hand was held throughout the whole process. And at that point I had written four books, and I'd written 3 books, and I ended up kickstarting the whole 5-book series. At this point, my sales are not significant. I'm getting something every month, but it's chump change. But this Kickstarter ended up raising $25,000 just out of nowhere, and there was a pretty nice profit margin in that. It wasn't just the cost of producing the books, which you don't always get in these high-end premium edition type Kickstarters, because a lot of the costs for those end up eating the entire profit margin. This was a simpler campaign and ended up getting higher profit margin. So I used that extra money to really learn the intricacies of internet marketing, how to do SEO, how to set up your author email system, how to build good author websites, how to set up a Patreon community, and how all this kind of stuff. And at that point, it was just slowly building, consistently writing, doing something to appear in front of people consistently, whether that's podcasting or showing up on someone else's show or doing YouTube or trying out different things, see what sticks, see what doesn't. It was really interesting. I don't think that my process was all that typical, but I'm very willing and eager to try out a lot of different approaches. So, and I'm willing to pivot on a dime, and I'm not afraid of putting things out when they're not absolutely perfect, like minimum viable product kind of thing, which is the way I did it for the first 5 years. And that has its cost, right? That got me the audience. And now I have enough people that I can support myself. And now I don't have to do that anymore, and I can focus more on quality and craft, which is what I'm really happy about right now. I don't know if that answered your question.
I'm weirdly in a similar place at the moment, right? Because one of the things with the diamond editions that I'm going back and cleaning them up, as someone in the chat noted, my first book is only okay. That's what they said. Thank you for that. But like any book could be better, right? And so I've been going through and sort of improving what already exists, which takes time, but it takes less time than writing a new book, right? And I can do both. And so now I'm in this weird spot where, like I said, no sub press edition because I've already got 3, and managing those special editions along with writing the new material has allowed me to, like I said, like handle new readers with the new material, right, and existing ones, but also to do stuff for the people who are here every time I start up a video and do stuff like that. So there's this sort of like multi-channel thing that develops as being a writer goes on, right? Where you are still, trying to produce new material, write new books. You're improving constantly, but you can also go back and improve what you've already done. When you're independently published, that's certainly easier. You can just unpublish a book on a dime and then update it. I probably this week will have Queen of Mid-Ashes improved. I've got the new cover finished, and the new pages are done. So
there's also one thing that I would add to that, Christopher. These are really great points that you're making. But somebody in the chat said something about I would be happy just to get one super fan, and actually that's exactly the right attitude. It's one at a time, and once you figure that out, it stops being this internet churn type thing, and you start to have actual relationships with individual readers. No, not in a creepy way, but like you encounter them on social media. Sometimes they'll email you. Sometimes they join your Patreon. And if you treat them like human beings, like they grew up in the world where the author is this, this figure out in the distance that you look at and bow towards every time the book comes down from the heavens, right? And suddenly now this is the world where the author can interact with you directly. And it makes for a really interesting experience of creating a bond between you and the reader that's very strong.
Yeah, yeah, no. When I was signing, I signed books at Quailridge Books around the time Disquiet Gods came out earlier this month. I recognized maybe most of the names.
Yeah.
Maybe I didn't know them necessarily very, very well, but there's a lot of familiar faces, right?
Mhm.
And that is the nature of the business ultimately. Unless you really, really, really make it big, right? Is customer service, right? Like anything, like I was a waiter for 7 years, right? You have regulars,
Yeah.
and you take care of them. Unless they're like those regulars, you're like, oh no, like can you take the Floyds, please? As those guys exist too, right?
Yes,
But
they
but
do.
you have your regular customers, and you take care of them, and if you can do that reliably, like it doesn't matter if you have 1,000 readers or 1,000,000, right? You'll probably be fine. Another thing I
Yeah.
wanted to mention too about the Kickstarters is if you can get one launched successfully, which you like don't even need the book for, right? But if you get it launched successfully enough, like Kickstarter will email you themselves and be like, "Hey, this is going great. Like, how do we make it bigger?"
Yeah.
I got an email from the head of publishing like right after we sold out. Was like, "What can we do to push this?" And I was like, "Nothing. It's done." Uh,
She's
you
really
know,
great though, by the way. Oriana, she's the head of publishing. She's a really nice lady. Yeah.
Yeah, she's lovely. But that helps, right? You don't have that with like the Amazon algorithm, right? So there's a white glove element to working with someone like Kickstarter.
Yeah.
Indiegogo as well. Uh, uh, they also emailed and were like, "Hey, do you want to move this over here? We could take you instead." Right? And
Yeah, I've gotten those too.
so there's some help there that there isn't just. Yeah, it's like you can do that. That's an option. But there is like there's a human element to this white glove thing, like I said, that you don't have just jumping on Amazon. So if you're just trying to start out in a vacuum, right, having more than one book is huge, right? But if you have one book, like the Kickstarter thing might get farther than you think, right? Especially if you're Jordan, someone with 2,000 YouTube subscribers, because it doesn't
Yeah,
take that much
actually, yeah.
to get the ball rolling. So not that the point of this stream was to convince you that you should do a Kickstarter, Jordan, but you should think about it. We got some more questions in the chat. Bill Emery's asks, how much data analysis goes into deciphering discoverability? I love trying to figure out narratives around Goodreads data. I assume Amazon has better dashboards. They're like a little better.
Not much.
But not by much. Yeah.
No, the way you figure out Amazon is by hiring people that do data scraping. Yeah, and so if you're the kind of person that's really good with following the data, there are companies that do this professionally. They're fantastic at it. They're really good. They just basically scrape all the available data on Amazon, and not on the back end. They're just looking at the sales pages and looking at the rankings and things like this. And there's one in particular. I forgot the name of the company. It'll come to me, but he has these reports on subgenres that cost like $35, and it gives you all the trends for what they were for the past 6 months, what they were for the past month, where they're trending, what they think will happen in the next 3, and these he cycles through them, once every 6 months or so. So you're constantly getting fresh information off of it. I'm somebody who like I said, if you give me a spreadsheet, I will crumple it up and throw it in your face and swear at you in Russian.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Minus the Russian.
But some people are really good at this, and they can take advantage of it for sure.
Yeah, no, there's a whole, parallel industry of doing this. Is something
Yeah.
my wife wants to get into because she's a data scientist by training. Just not publishing, right? But data is data. So
Data is data.
Nexus asks, are those trad contracts you were talking about really that common? Sounds ridiculous. I haven't seen, none of the contracts I've seen have asked for life of copyright. But that may have been because my agent prevented them from trying that before I even saw them. It's a possibility, because that is obviously a ridiculous ask. But in going into like any contract negotiation, right? Like the other party, the one who's drafting the contract, is going to try and get as much as humanly possible, right? And it behooves you to read the contract, right, and pay attention to anything, right? And this is true if you're dealing with traditional publishers or if you're dealing with like a small press. And then there are some publishers that are really like Amazon package services, right? And they'll call themselves publishers,
Yes.
but what they will do is they will like put your book on Amazon Kindle Direct for you, which you don't like. Don't pay those people.
And
right?
they ask for a ton of money too. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, no. I mean, like, if you're gonna do that, just like go pay, for your own editor and your own cover. Like, don't. There are places that'll like, hey, we'll like coordinate all that for you and then give you your book back and you can put it on Amazon. But if they're like, hey, we'll like run your accounts for you, like you don't need that. Amazon does direct deposit, it'll be fine. But in dealing with but point is there are even things that are like on the indie side where you're gonna like be faced with a contract, right? Even if that's like we haven't talked about sub rights at all, right? Like even if you're independently published, right? You may be dealing with a contract for like an audiobook, right? And you're going to need to read that and you're going to need to make sure that you understand like what you're giving away and stuff. So, but if you're to talk about traditional publishing contracts, right? Like go in there and you look like, are they buying world English rights or are they buying North American English rights? Because you can like break those up and you can say, hey, I'm going to resell them to a British publisher, right? Are they buying your translation rights? Some publishers like will try to get them up front. You should like never part with those, if you have a choice, right? I have an agent who does foreign sales. And so by keeping those sales, he was able to go sell them, and I think it's like 7 other languages now. So that's like money for books I can't even read. In most cases, right? And so you want to hold on to that stuff, but it's also, but yeah, they are going to like ask for more than you want to give them. And like, that's one of the things that in traditional publishing, at least, a good agent is supposed to be on your side for, right? And there is like a conversation about agents that like should probably be had, right? In that their interests do not 100% align with yours, right? Unless you've been with them for a long time. The longer you're with an agent, the more your interests align. But like, if you're a new writer and you sign with an agent, their interest is to sell you to a publisher for as much money as they can possibly get on the advance right now, because they will get 15% of that. And if you flop, they made money, and they will tell you, hey, you made money and you made more money than you would have made otherwise. So congratulations. Don't cry about it. I'm sorry they won't sign you for more books, but right? Because their goal is as much money today as possible. There are some agents who take a longer view of things, but most agents are going to say, hey, like, we're going to try to get 50 grand out of these guys. We're going to try to get 100 grand out of them. And you probably will never earn all of that out, right? Big advances like don't help you as a traditionally published author, right. Really. They're all they really do is constitute another expense that your publisher needs to make up before they consider your account a success, because they're looking at like the bottom line, how much money have they spent on you, right? And if a lot of that was just paying you, right, they were gonna like there's this Twitter trend a couple years ago where everyone was talking about how much publishing paid them. And it was writers like, oh, I can't believe that they paid you more than me. Why would they do that? Is it because they're sexist or something? They're and the silly thing about this whole thing, right, is that like publishing pays you either more than you're worth or exactly as much as you sold, right? And this is broadly true kind of across the board, right? Because you will never the only way that you will get more money than the number of books you've sold is if they gave you more in the advance, right? And that will only hurt you actually long term, right? Because if the publisher does not make up your advances, they might just drop you. It'll be like, look, like we're cut our losses. I know we signed you for 4 books, but like we're 3 books in, and you haven't earned out the first one. Just keep the like quarter of your advance that you got from signing, the contract in the first place 5 years ago. We're not gonna take the L on the rest of this. We're done, right? That happens all the time in traditional publishing, right? And so big advance is superficially attractive, but it's not worth it in like a long game at all, right? But you want to hold on to as much of those other things as you can, right? You don't want to give them your film rights, right? You don't want to give them, you may have to give them audio. Like that's becoming a thing that traditional publishers like. It's like, look, you have to give us the audio or no deal, right?
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of money in audio, but you don't have to give them film rights. You don't have to give them translation rights or anything like that, and there's room to look at things like life of copyright and even like royalty percentages, especially with some of these newer houses. Like I was saying, they're more dynamic on like how much a writer can make per copy. 10% for a hardcover used to be standard, but I've seen as high as 35 in traditional publishing. But that's contingent on there being no advance, and like maybe you have to give up some other things, but it's a process. And this is where, if you don't have an agent, if you're trying the independent thing, you're dealing with a small press or something, like maybe hire a lawyer for a few hours.
100%.
Get them to look at it for you. Like that's an expense, but like it's not as much of an expense as what you could suffer if you don't read the fine print,
Yep.
right? So just be careful. And be, if you're dealing with agents, this is more of a trad pub thing. If you're dealing with trad pub period, and anyone asks you for money, they're a criminal. Don't trust them. Now, if you're doing indie stuff, right, there's a lot of reasons to give people money, but traditional publishing, the money should come to you, never go the other way. I had some, I did editing once for this poor old lady who wrote her memoir, and she sold it to a vanity press, and she didn't know what the difference was, and she was asking me when it was going to be in Barnes and Noble, and I had to explain like that this is not what happened, right? Like they will print you they'll print you as many copies as you order from them, but that's not how books get to the bookstore, right? Like you've got one for all your family now, but like that is what this is, right? So just be careful if you're trying to get into Barnes and Noble. Don't give anybody money. It should come to you. But yeah, I to answer the initial question again briefly, I haven't seen Life of Copyright, but I'm sure it's out there.
If anybody's interested in this, check out Christine Catherine Rush's blog, chriswrites.com, KRIS rights.com. She blogs about rights violations constantly, and if all you do is just read her blog, you'll never publish trad. So I'm not saying do that necessarily, but she has real life examples of situations where authors were not careful and signed away all their rights without realizing that was going on. So Christopher's absolutely right. You need to come in with all eyes open.
Yeah, just imagine that you are in your fantasy novel and you're dealing with demons, and and for some reason you're inclined to sign a contract with them. Don't do that. But they aren't actually demons, right? So it's fine. You just have to read the lawyers are close. They're close, but just just be careful, right? And look through the contract carefully, read it a lot, and if you have an uncle who's a lawyer, that helps. But
if he's a good lawyer,
if he's a good lawyer.
If he's not, it won't help.
Yeah, but if you know somebody, that helps. But otherwise, like pay for a lawyer, like get someone to look at it.
Yeah.
That's supposed to be your agent's job, but like I still had a lawyer look at the contract.
Agents aren't lawyers.
No, and sometimes they aren't looking as hard as they should. That happens sometimes too. Even good agents make mistakes, and it can be tricky to extricate yourself from a situation. There is room with publishers to like renegotiate. That can be done. Even though you're talking about like buyback clauses are not super common anymore, and sometimes reversion clauses can be like pretty hard to get out of, right? The reversion clause, when something reverts, right? It's when you get your rights to your books back, right? Sometimes it's just time. It's like you get the book back after X time, but it's usually like, if after X time the book is no longer in print, where in print is defined as right, X number of sales over time, not counting ebooks, right? Because there's a period where traditional publishing counted the existence of an ebook file as in print, and like they weren't reverting anything. And this was like a whole big, a whole big lawsuit. I would say like around like 2005, 2000, something like that. If I remember my history correctly, but that is that they don't count ebooks anymore. But they tried. So you just got to be careful.
Speaking of the just agenting process and just industry trends themselves. Maybe this is something that like either of you guys could answer. So as I was saying, like my wife and I are going through the process right now of submitting to agents. And so our book right now is 225,000 words long. I know I could shorten it. Like I know that. But you know, like all of the books on my shelf that are fantasy novels are that long or much, much longer. And every booktuber that I watch is like behind them is a gigantic wall of books that are that long. Like my book is shorter than, you know, the first Mistborn book, right? And we're getting rejected like immediately
because of the word count.
Almost every time. And my impression is that it's almost entirely about the length. Like these agents are telling us directly that it's too long. And because of that, most of them aren't even getting past the first line of our query letter. And some of them are just looking at the length in Query Tracker and just hitting reject. And we can see that on our end now with Query Tracker. And so it's actually been quite the bummer. And I'll say this, I know I'm biased, but the book is at the very least not bad. I am a competent writer at least, and my wife and I are both highly educated, and so I know I'm biased and I shouldn't toot my own horn at all, but I know it doesn't suck. I know that. I don't know if it's the comps that we're giving in our query letter. I mean, we have one agent, Matt Bialer, who is Pat Rothfuss's agent. He asked for a full a while back, and at the time he was the only agent we had submitted to, and we have found that he is like the only agent now that is accepting novels, manuscripts the length of ours.
He asked for a full?
Yeah, he did, and then he asked for a rewrite.
Oh, his first query too, Nicholas. I hate Jordan.
That's really good.
And he said he would consider representing us if we fixed a bunch of the stuff that he wanted us to fix. So he's been great. His main criticism was that he felt that the book didn't really grip him until page 300. And so we fixed the beginning. We made it more entertaining. We cut a lot of stuff out. But it's been frustrating running. And we're waiting for him to get back to us. He acknowledged the receipt of our resubmission. And we submitted it to him like we did the other agents. Like we did a full submission to all the agents, but Matt was the only person. Matt was the one guy. I was using him to like test out to see what would happen.
Yeah.
So I know that's a lot, but the question I wanted to ask is I'm getting the sense from going through this process that the attention span in this industry is changing. Of those agents who do accept fantasy and sci-fi literature, many seem to want manuscripts of less than 150,000 words. They only want to see the first 5 pages. Most of them now, they say they want to be hooked immediately. And many of them have these like really idiosyncratic and hyper-specific demands of what they want to see and what they don't want to see. And I'm not kidding you guys. I don't expect a comment here on this. One of the agents said that they wanted YA thruples. They wanted to see more YA thruples. And immediately I almost barfed. It's like, well, why do you want to see that? Maybe we should put you in jail. How about that? But I'm starting to get the sense, sorry, that what a lot of these agents are looking for is essentially YA fantasy romance, 100,000 words. Is that true? Does any of this ring a bell? And do you guys have experience with this?
I can speak to the length thing. I mean, attention span is part of the problem because agents aren't like hurting for options, right? You know, they come into work on Monday, or rather they turn on their phones, right? And they've got 300 emails, right? So they never really have to compromise. They can get exactly what they want because someone will write it eventually. The million monkeys with their typewriters will deliver what they're looking for. However,
and now AI is going to do it too very soon. So
there's the robots are out there. Speaking of the demons, fortunately, at least, like this is like the one thing about trad is like basically every level of the industry there, people don't like the robots. So you know, there's that. But as far as the length goes, that really is like an economic concern. Because the longer, I've said this like 100 times, but like the longer the book is, the fewer copies will get printed because they cost more. And so if your book is, 300,000 words, right, they're going to print a third as many as they'd print if it was 100,000 words. They might print like a quarter as many because it just costs more, especially now paper is so expensive. Yeah. obviously the bane of my existence with books 4 and 5. But this means that they're printing fewer copies, which means they'll be reaching fewer readers, which means that your initial momentum is going to be slowed down. Those hardcovers, Empire of Silence, are so hard to find because they printed about 5,000 of them, and now that's too few. It wasn't too few for 2018 and 2019. It sold out exactly as quickly. Traditional publishers want to see that initial print run sell out in about 12 months. And it pretty much did that. Some copies ended up getting remaindered, which meant they went back to the warehouse and they got wholesaled for whoever wanted them, right? But you want to see that sell through go in about 12 months, and that's what happened. But now it's too few and people can't find them, right? So if the book had been shorter, they might have printed 2 or 3 times as many, because there would have been more orders from bookstores. So you're talking about the bookstore being the customer, Nicholas. Publishers will go and they will have meetings with their sales reps whose job it is, like, your account is Walmart, your account is Barnes & Noble, your account is Books A Million, right? You have to go to them and convince them that these products are where they're purchasing, right? Because publishers actually get the money sort of in this wave when the bookstores order the books, right? And then they will return unsold books after a period of time, and the publishers to reimburse the bookstore for whatever didn't sell. So they get the publisher also gets the money in like an advance, basically. And then it gets remunerated later depending on how many copies didn't sell. And so so they have to, so literally the bookstore is the customer, right? Amazon is the customer. And Amazon's something like 60% of like print sale market share in the United States at this point. I mean, Amazon's the only game in town. I learned recently that Disquiet Gods is in like 4% of Barnes and Nobles, and like I had my best launch ever. That's like completely without bookstores. Yeah,
that's insane.
Why?
That's a long story, but suffice it to say, basically, because Barnes and Noble has changed their strategy in terms of how they stock things, and it's harder for publishers to say you should stock this book than it used to be, because they would say you should stock this book and they would hand them money, and they can't do that anymore, my understanding. And so the local stores are picking whatever they stock, and so I basically give the bookstore if the local manager wants my book there. I'm not Brandon Sanderson, so they don't, and that's fine. It turns out like I haven't actually needed bookstores to get the sales that I've had lately, so that's interesting. And yes, as Belemmer says, book 6 is kind of hard to promote, but also book 1 is in about 5% of Barnes and Nobles there, Belemmer. So it's bookstores, it's not book 6. And so you run into these problems, but the longer the book gets, the harder it is to convince these accounts to pick up copies, fundamentally, because you can make the book more expensive the longer the book is, but you can't make it so much more expensive that it justifies all the extra paper. So you're just profiting less. Publishers profit less per copy the longer the book gets. And so there is like a serious like just market incentive to target like 100, 150,000 word. There's like a material cost thing. So I mean,
that being said, you were published with a with a doorstopper, so.
Well, I wasn't. I had a 130,000 word book when I sold it.
Okay.
And my editor was like, "We published Chad Williams. You could just do whatever you want. Add all the stuff to the book. It'll be fine." And I'm glad that she said that, because I like Empire of Silence better than the original book. But I snuck in sort of through the back door with the extra 150,000 words there. It was not the plan. I was supposed to write 4 like 150,000 word books and be done, and not 7 quarter million word books, which is why I'm still trapped with half a book to go. I haven't escaped yet.
And we're the happier for it.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, so let's see, we got a couple more questions. Maybe thought I saw one. Because we're pretty close to, we're almost at 2 hours, so we should wrap it up here pretty soon. Yeah, it's getting late. Nathan, hey Nathan. When it comes to independent publishing, what are the ideal places to look for cover designers? That is a really that's a really good question. Nathan, I do know one if you need one. But you got an answer there, Nicholas?
So there's two ways you can do this. You can just go straight to Reedsy, Reedsy. Christopher, you talked about how editors and things are now all becoming freelance. They all go onto Reedsy. That's the marketplace for writer related freelancers of all kinds. The funniest thing was I found my former agent there, hawking his wares as an editor, which was hilarious.
That's
but
awesome.
I didn't leave him a bad review though. I was like, that's enough. You find like award-winning cover designers there, people who do stuff for major TradPub projects. That's the first way. The issue with that is that it's becoming a little bit saturated, so they really do have the pick of the litter. The designers do. So to attract them, you have to put in a little bit of work to make sure that your project is actually interesting. It's not like it was 6 years ago when they were just basically willing to work for anybody for money. Now there's tons of writers, so they look for the stuff that they want. The other way to do it is look at Amazon or in the bookstore at indie published books, not trad published books, but indie published books in your niche, and see what you like, and look at the inside flap of the cover, and usually the cover designer is right there, so you can find them based on. But especially look at the niche that you write in and in indie, because trad covers don't worry so much about Amazon and milking the algorithm, but indie books have to. So indie covers tend to work. They're optimized for Amazon readers better than trad publishing covers are. On the other hand, trad publishing covers are much better. They just look better most of the time. But
yeah. There are exceptions. But,
there are exceptions, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So why don't we do one more, and we'll wrap it on up. Milan asks, do you guys have some tips for things for your Patreon content wise? And you're welcome. Thank you for emailing me. Yeah. Do you have any Patreon advice there, Nicholas? I've got some thoughts, but you're the expert.
No, hardly. But my problem is I throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks, which works sometimes. I think a smart way of thinking about this is to figure out why your audience is there. So this will only be relevant when you have enough people that you can actually survey them and get a result that actually makes sense. But if you have enough people that have come on already, and you can ask them, are you there because you want to get a service from me, or are you there because you want to support my work? If they're there to get a service, then you have to provide that service. Otherwise they'll leave. If they're there because they want to support you and they love your work, then you can do whatever you like. And I've tried a lot of different things for my Patreon. The thing that's been most successful is coaching other authors. It's the most lucrative thing because people are willing to pay for coaching. But the thing that gets the most interaction is basically something like, you know how there's a guy named Austin Kleon. He's a poet and a visual artist. He's got a series of books that's very good. One of the books is called Show Your Work, and the entire premise of the book is basically practice in public and do it in a way that people can see the process, which is very scary because you're going to be sharing things that aren't optimized. But if you're willing to do that, there is a kind of reader that will go to Patreon and give you money for that kind of experience. And you just have to remember that the people that are there on Patreon are probably your super fans. So be generous and don't be afraid of them, because they're probably there because they love you.
Yeah, that's been my experience too. I mostly use the thing I most do with Patreon is give my readers like very granular updates about how things are going. I'll do like a weekly post, like how many words precisely I wrote that week, that sort of thing. Just so that there's like always something. And I figure the people who are willing to pay for that care about that level of information, right? In a way that like signing up for a newsletter they won't, right? And that keeps the channels of communication open. I find I don't get a lot of messages on Patreon. I just get people signing up and they just sort of are around. I do feel like I don't do enough with it, so that's something I'm going to be looking at here in the next little bit. Another project for the stack. But yeah, it's one of those things. Talking about those concentric circles, right? It's just figuring out how to take care of, really, in a sense, that smallest circle, right?
Yes,
because those are people who pay you mostly for existing.
Yes.
Well, I can tell you, Christopher, that's what, as a former patron of yours, like as someone who used to pay you $5-10 a month, I forget what it was. It was actually about none of those things you mentioned. It wasn't the little bookmarks. I do like those. Those are really cool. The little cards that you did for each book. Those are great. And it wasn't the updates. I didn't even read those. I just wanted to, and this was back when you weren't selling as many books as you are now. I wanted to make sure you could survive as a writer. Yeah. It's someone like you, the person that I know, who's a really interesting guy who has all of the influences that I have. I wanted to make sure someone like you could survive and make a living and keep writing books, and that you would stay employed and that I would keep getting those books. You know what I mean? It wasn't about the Patreon. I wanted to make sure you were getting paid and you could like pay your mortgage.
Yeah, no, that I think is the main reason people sign up for things like that.
Yeah.
It's just you have to figure out something to give them for it, right? You know, you can't just be like, here, put money in this box, please.
Starving artist.
I mean, some people do that, and it's really annoying.
Yeah, I can't in good conscience just like put out the tin cup and just stand there like this, right? I need
the GoFundMe page, you know.
I need to at least pretend to be a statue, right? Juggle something, right?
There you go.
But yeah, so but this, like everything else, is something you have to tailor to like your own strengths. I think you should if you are not if you're not a very conversational person, maybe don't do the coaching thing, right?
Definitely not.
You know, like do play to your strengths and not against type. That's really the only concrete piece of advice.
And honestly, Patreon's not for everybody. It's some people just shouldn't do it. And the platform itself isn't very good. It's not conducive to social sharing, and it kind of disappears in people's inboxes. But what am I complaining about? It gives me a nice paycheck every month, so I'm not complaining.
Yeah, well, and the reason to do it is this is a very strange business, right? And you get paid in weird ways and at weird times, and in varying amounts. And so anything that you can add to give some sort of cushion of stability there that helps you, get through is worth doing, as long as you can provide your readers something valuable for it, right? Like I said, I'm not the tin cup guy, but you got to do something, right? But yeah, I think we'll call it there then, since we've been going for 2 hours, and I really appreciate you both spending your evening here, and I appreciate all of you all in the chat being here. Thanks too. For having me. Yeah, thanks for coming on, and hope we got some stuff sort of clarified, covered, talked about with regard to publishing. There's of course an ocean's worth of more nonsense that could be discussed perhaps some other time. But Nicholas, Jordan, thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks, Christopher.
All right. Bye, guys. And